The deed was in her hands when he tried to take it. Harriet Carter stood in the middle of the Callow Creek land office, her fingers white-knuckled around the folded paper, her jaw set like the iron posts she had driven into that untamed Kansas earth with her own 2 hands. The room smelled of tobacco smoke and old wood, and the particular kind of arrogance that certain men wore like a second skin. Across the narrow oak counter, Gerald Prout, land agent, self-appointed authority, and the third man that week to look at her as though she had walked into the wrong building, was not smiling anymore. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying that slow, deliberate patience that men used when they wanted a woman to feel foolish without technically saying so, "I am telling you for your own benefit that this claim is contested. You do not want to be tangled up in that kind of trouble." Harriet did not move. "Whose contest?" "Randall Cobb. He's had his eye on that section for 2 seasons. He has resources, ma'am. He does not have my 6 months of improvements," she said. "He does not have my well, my fence line, or my notarized survey. And he does not have my deed, which I am holding in my hands, which you yourself signed and dated the 17th of April, 1874. The silence in the office was enormous. A fly moved against the window glass. Outside, a horse shifted its weight on the hitching post and the leather creaked. Prout leaned forward and lowered his voice as though they were conspirators. "Cobb has friends on the Territorial Commission, Miss Carter. That deed can be revisited. Contested deeds go back into review, and during that review period, occupancy can be challenged. And are you threatening me?" she asked. She said it without heat. She said it the way a woman says something when she already knows the answer and is simply building a record. The door behind her opened. She did not turn around. She had learned never to turn her back on the man she was already watching. "Something the matter here, Gerald?" The voice was low, unhurried, and carried the quiet weight of someone who had no particular need to raise it. Harriet felt rather than saw the man step up to the counter beside her, close enough that she caught the smell of horses and cedar and honest labor. She turned then, because she chose to, and she looked at him. He was perhaps 28 or 29, lean and sun-darkened, with light gray eyes that were doing something interesting. They were reading the situation rather than inserting themselves into it. He wore a plainsman's coat and a hat with the brim shaped by use rather than vanity. There was a badge on his coat, small and unpolished, that said Deputy Callow County. He was not looking at Harriet with the particular kind of sympathy that felt like condescension. He was looking at Prout. "Gerald," he said again. Prout straightened. "Levi, this is a land office matter. I'm just explaining the lay of things to the lady." "Seems like the lady understood the lay of things before she came in," the deputy said. "Deed's hers." "It's mine," Harriet said. He nodded, as though that settled it, and turned those gray eyes on her for the first time directly. "Levi Atkins," he said. "Deputy Sheriff." "Harriet Carter," she said. "Claim it." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, the acknowledgement of one. "If Cobb wants to contest," he said, turning back to Prout, "he files through proper channels. He doesn't use the land office as a pressure point. That deed stands until a court says otherwise, and the last time I checked, Randall Cobb has not been appointed to any court." Prout's jaw tightened. "You're overstepping, Levi." "Probably," Levi said. He stepped back slightly, which was not a retreat but a deliberate giving of space back to Harriet. "Miss Carter, if you need a copy of that deed registered at the sheriff's office for safekeeping, that's available to you. It was such a small thing, such a quiet, specific thing. Not let me take care of this for you, not you should have a husband handle this. Just an option offered, a door held open, and then stillness." Harriet looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she looked back at Prout and tucked the deed into the inner pocket of her coat. "Good day, Mr. Prout," she said. She walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame and glanced back at the deputy. "Thank you, Mr. Atkins." "Ma'am," he said. She walked out into the blazing Kansas afternoon, and she thought, "That is the first man who did not try to talk me out of it." She had not always been the kind of woman who showed up alone to land offices and held deeds against men who wanted to take them. Or perhaps she had always been that kind of woman and had simply needed the right kind of trouble to prove it. Harriet Carter had come west from Cincinnati in the spring of 1873, 19 months before the scene in Pruitt's office, at the age of 25. She had come with $200 saved over 4 years of working as a seamstress and a bookkeeper's assistant, with a carpet bag, a rifle she had taught herself to shoot in a cousin's cornfield, and a folded copy of the Homestead Act of 1862 that she had read so many times the paper was soft as cloth at the folds. The act was plain enough in its language: 160 acres to any citizen who was the head of a household, or who had reached the age of 21, who paid the filing fee, built a dwelling, and improved the land for 5 years. It said any citizen. It did not say any male citizen, because a woman had successfully lobbied that language into clarity a decade prior, and Harriet had found that court precedent and written it down in the same notebook as the act itself, because she knew she would need it. She had known she would need it because of every man she had told about her plan before she left Cincinnati. Her father, who told her the frontier would kill her. Her older brother, who told her she was being romantic and foolish. The banker who told her that a woman without a husband had no business owning real property, even if the law technically said otherwise. The pastor who told her that her restlessness was a spiritual problem. Not one of them had said, "Here is how you file. Here is what the soil is like in Kansas. Here is which season to arrive. Here is what you will need in the first winter." None of them had helped. They had only discouraged, which she had eventually come to understand as a kind of dark gift, because it had made her research absolutely everything herself, which meant she had arrived in Kansas territory knowing more about the Homestead Act than most of the men she met, and knowing more about dryland farming and well digging and sodhouse construction than she had any right to know from books. She had ridden the Kansas Pacific Railroad to Ellsworth in April of 1873, taken a mail coach east and south to the smaller settlement of Callow Creek, which was not yet incorporated as a town but had a land office, a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, a church under construction, and approximately 60 permanent residents who looked at her arrival with a range of responses from curiosity to outright suspicion. The land she filed on was in the second tier of sections south of the creek, land that more established homesteaders had passed over because it had poor surface water and a reputation for hard clay subsoil. Harriet had read about drilling wells through clay, and she had calculated that the lack of surface water meant fewer competing claims, and the clay, once broken, held moisture through drought better than sandy loam. It was a bet. Everything out here was a bet. The difference between her and the people who had told her not to come was that she had done the math on the bet. The first summer was brutal in ways the books had not fully communicated. The heat was not like Cincinnati heat, which was wet and heavy. This was a dry, relentless, stripping kind of heat that pulled moisture out of everything: her lips, her hands, the green of the grass, the will of weaker settlers, who she watched pack up and go back east in ones and twos through July and August. She did not go back. She dug her well with a rented rig, hit water at 32 feet, cased the shaft with stone she quarried from a dry creek bed 2 miles south, and built her first dwelling from sod cut out of the deep-rooted prairie grass. It was not beautiful. It was functional and solid and dry and hers. She planted winter wheat in September, learned from a neighboring homesteader named Obadiah Marsh, a laconic Kansas widower who communicated primarily in grunts, but who knew the land like a scripture, exactly how deep to set the seed and how to read the sky for the kind of storms that came sideways and without warning. She survived the winter of 1873 to 1874 in her sod house, burning twisted grass and dried buffalo chips for fuel when her wood ran low, eating from the stores she had laid in with a thoroughness that had seemed excessive in October and proved barely adequate by March. By April of 1874, she had her first measurable wheat crop in the ground. She had expanded her sod structure to include a separate root cellar, and she had filed for her deed at the Callow Creek Land Office. And that was when the trouble with Randall Cobb had begun. And that was the chain of events that had led her to be standing in that office holding her deed with white-knuckled hands when Levi Atkins walked through the door. She did not think about him much after that first day. She had work to do, but she thought about him a little. Randall Cobb was not a homesteader. He was a range cattleman with 7,000 acres already patented in the region, and the particular appetite of a man who had made one kind of success and mistaken it for a license to make any kind. He ran Texas Longhorns on open range and had spent the years before the homesteaders arrived regarding the surrounding land as informally his, and the arrival of settlers with legal claims had been received by him as a kind of personal insult rather than a legal reality. He was not the first such man in Kansas. He would not be the last. He had the resources to hire a lawyer who could file contesting paperwork that meant nothing in law but cost time and money and nerves to respond to. And he had the social connections to make the land office inconvenient for people who did not have help navigating it. And he had the physical presence. 3 hired hands who were not exactly cowhands, and a foreman named Dutch Carver, who wore his pistol with an ease that suggested he was more familiar with using it than most working cowboys. To communicate an ambient threat to isolated homesteaders, most of the people he pressured eventually left. The ones who didn't were generally men with families and neighbors close enough to make collective pressure difficult. Harriet was neither a man nor, technically, close to neighbors, though Obadiah Marsh was 2 miles northeast, and there was a family named Hollies who had filed 3 sections over to the west. She was isolated in the particular way that single women homesteaders were isolated, which was not just geographic but social. She did not have the informal network of male connection that let men trade favors and information and mutual defense without it needing to be explicitly organized. Cobb sent Dutch Carver to her claim in the 2nd week of May, 2 weeks after the scene at the land office. She was mending fence on the south boundary when they rode up Carver and 2 others, big men on big horses, taking up space the way certain men did when they wanted to make a point about space. She straightened and set down her wire tool and waited. "Miss Carter," Carver said. He had a round, unexpressive face and pale eyes. "Mr. Cobb sends his regards." "Does he?" she said. "He's been thinking about that section of yours, thinking it might be more trouble than it's worth to you. He'd like to make an offer." Carver reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. $150 for your improvements and your filing. You take the money, you withdraw the claim, and you go back wherever you came from. Nobody gets hurt, nobody has hard feelings. $150. She had spent nearly $200 to get here and the same again in her first year of improvements. He was offering her a loss and calling it generosity. She looked at the paper without taking it. "Tell Mr. Cobb no thank you." Carver did not put the paper away. "Miss Carter, I'd encourage you to think about this carefully. A woman alone out here can run into a lot of difficulties. Wells can go dry, fences can come down, barns can catch fire." She felt the threat land. She was not too proud to feel fear. She simply had long experience with fear, having been afraid of different kinds of failure since she was 16 years old, and she had learned that the presence of fear was not the same thing as the necessity of surrender. "Are you threatening federal property?" she said. "Because what I am standing on is a federal homestead claim filed under the Act of 1862, which makes interference with it a federal matter." Carver blinked. He had not expected the words "federal matter" to come out of this woman's mouth. "I'll be registering this conversation at the sheriff's office this afternoon," she continued. "Date your name, the names of these 2 gentlemen if you'd care to provide them, and the nature of the offer and the implied threat. For the record." She paused. "Good day, Mr. Carver." He rode off. He did not look happy about it, but he rode off. She drove her wagon to Callow Creek that afternoon and she went to the sheriff's office and she sat across from a deputy named Levi Atkins, and she reported the conversation with the careful, specific detail of someone who understood that records mattered. He listened. He wrote everything down in a ledger with the deliberate care of a man who took the act of recording seriously. He did not interrupt. He did not suggest she might have misunderstood. He did not ask if she had a male relative he could speak with about it. When she finished, he read it back to her to confirm accuracy. "That's correct," she said. "Good." He blotted the page. "You know the sheriff is friendly with Cobb." She looked at him. "I wondered. I'm telling you because you should know. I'm not the sheriff. My record keeping is my own, and it'll go to the county seat if anything happens on your claim that looks like it came from this conversation. Is that standard procedure?" He looked at her directly. "No, but it's what the situation warrants." She studied him. He was not playing hero. There was no performance in it, no expectation of gratitude or admiration. He was simply naming a reality and telling her what he intended to do about it, which was exactly what she had spent 2 years wishing the men in her life would do instead of telling her what she should do. "Thank you," she said. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and picked up her hat. "Mr. Atkins, does the sheriff know you do this kind of record keeping?" "Probably," he said. "He hasn't said anything yet." She put her hat on. "Why do you stay, then?" "If the situation is. Because most of the people on the other side of that desk need someone on this side who actually does the job," he said. He said it simply, without complaint or martyrdom, just a fact he had organized his choices around. She went home and thought about him more than a little. Levi Atkins had come to Callow Creek by way of a longer road than most people guessed. He had been born in 1846 in Missouri, the fourth son of a small farmer who had kept more or less clear of the guerrilla violence that tore Missouri apart during the Civil War years, by the combination of geographic luck and a father who had a horror of organized killing that overrode whatever political sympathies he might have otherwise expressed. Levi had been 17 when the war ended, and had spent 3 years afterward doing what a generation of young men did: drifting, working cattle drives north out of Texas, learning the particular skills of open country survival in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with necessity. He had been deputized in 1870 in Abilene, during the cattle boom years when the Texas drives were hitting the railheads and the towns were half wild with it. He had worked under a marshal there who was a fair man and a good one, and he had learned from that man that the law was only as good as the people enforcing it, and that the badge was not a symbol of authority so much as a symbol of obligation. He had moved to Callow Creek in 1872 when the sheriff there, a man named Horatio Vance, had needed a deputy, and the pay was steady, and the town was small enough that the problems were not yet completely out of hand. Vance was not a dishonest man exactly. He was a man who preferred to minimize conflict by deferring to whoever had the most social weight, and in Callow Creek that meant Randall Cobb, which meant that the law in the town had a certain directional lean that Levi found increasingly difficult to work around without either direct confrontation or creative record-keeping. He chose creative record-keeping, mostly. He was not a man who avoided confrontation out of fear, but he understood that direct confrontation without documentation or legal backing was just another form of violence, and he had seen enough violence to know that it rarely actually settled anything. He had also come to know, in his time in Callow Creek, that the homesteaders arriving under the Homestead Act were genuinely building something, not just filing claims, but making a kind of country that was different from what the open-range cattlemen wanted, a country made of smaller pieces held by more hands, which was messier and louder and more complicated, and which was, in his estimation, more like what the land was actually supposed to be used for. He had no hidden motive when he helped Harriet Carter. He had the same motive he had when he helped any legal claimant, the belief that the law meant what it said, and that his job was to enforce what it meant. What made her different was not that he wanted to help her. It was that she didn't need his help in the sense of needing someone to act for her. She needed the system to work. She needed the record to exist. She needed the specific institutional support that his position gave him access to. And she knew exactly what she needed, which meant that helping her was a matter of doing his job correctly rather than performing a rescue. He found this so unusual that he thought about it for days afterward. He thought about her in particular, the way she had sat across from him at the desk and listed the details of Carver's visit with the precision of a person who had anticipated that they would need those details later. The way she had asked about the sheriff, not timidly, but as a direct and necessary question. The way she had put her hat on when she stood up, as though the hat were armor she was putting back on after allowing herself a moment of openness. She came back to the land office 3 weeks later, and then to his office a week after that, and then to the general store on a Tuesday morning when he was picking up supplies, and they talked for 20 minutes in the street about the Territorial Commission's recent ruling on contested homestead claims, which had come down in favor of the original filers in most cases, and about the implications of that for the situation with Cobb. It was not courting, or it was not obviously courting. It was two people who found each other's company worth seeking out for reasons that had to do, officially, with a shared situation and its legal dimensions, and unofficially with something else neither of them had named yet. The unnamed thing grew through June and July of 1874 with the slow inevitability of Harriet's wheat, which came up that year in thick, promising rows that made her feel a kind of bone-deep satisfaction she had not known she was capable of. Obadiah Marsh came by in early July, looked at her wheat, and made a sound that she had learned to translate as approval. He was 62 and walked with a limp from an old horse injury and communicated in a compressed vocabulary that had taken her months to decode, but he had become something close to a neighbor and something close to a friend, and she valued his opinion of her crops in the same way she valued a mathematician's opinion of her calculation. "Deputy's been riding your fence line," he said, on his way out. He said it without looking at her, loading himself back onto his horse. She looked up from where she was writing in her field journal. "What? Past couple weeks, evening passes mostly. Your south boundary where Cobb's range runs up. He gathered his reins, not reporting it official. Just writing." She was quiet for a moment. "Why?" Obadiah glanced at her with the expression of a man who thought the answer was obvious. "Likely because he doesn't want Carver to come back for a night visit," he said. "Just a guess." He touched his hat brim and rode north. She sat with that information for the rest of the evening, turning it over. Levi Atkins was riding her fence line, not because she had asked him to, not as a formal part of his duties, because he had decided that her claim was worth protecting and had been quietly doing so without making any kind of announcement about it. She could have been annoyed by that, the presumption, the unasked-for protection. But she was not annoyed, and she was honest enough with herself to examine why. She was not annoyed because he had not told her about it in a way designed to make her feel grateful or obligated. He had not told her about it at all. He had just done it. If Obadiah hadn't mentioned it, she might never have known, which meant it was not a gesture made for her appreciation. It was just an action made for her benefit. The distinction felt important. It felt like the difference between a man who helped because he wanted to be seen helping, and a man who helped because the helping was the point. She finished her journal entry, and then she sat for a while in the cooling evening outside her sod house and watched the stars come up over the flat Kansas horizon, and she thought, "This is not something I planned for." She rode into Callow Creek the following Saturday on the excuse of needing flour and a new spool of wire, and she found Levi at the livery stable seeing to his horse, a compact blue roan that he handled with the particular patience of someone who understood that horses were co-workers rather than equipment. She tied her wagon horse to the post and watched him for a moment before he noticed her. He looked up. Something eased slightly in his expression when he saw her, a small and involuntary relaxation that she filed away. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Atkins," she said, "I hear you've been riding my south fence line." He did not flinch or look away or make an explanation. "Your neighbor told you." "He did." She kept her voice even. "I want to understand your reasoning." He set down the brush he was using on the roan's flank and turned to face her properly. Cobb hasn't pushed again. Carver's the kind of man who thinks about witnesses. I don't have a legal basis to camp on your claim, but a regular passage within sight of it most evenings costs me about 30 minutes and tells Carver that someone's paying attention. He paused. I should have told you it's your land. You have the right to know what's happening on it. She looked at him. Yes, she said, I do, and I appreciate the thought behind it. I want to be clear about that, but I want to be consulted about things that involve my property. That's fair, he said immediately. Not defensive, not explaining himself further, just acceptance. She found this so disarming that she had to look away for a moment. She looked at the roan. What's his name? She asked. Cedar, he said. That's a good name. She looked back at him. If you want to keep riding the line, you have my permission, and I would like to know the schedule so I can plan accordingly. He held her gaze. Tuesday and Friday evenings, generally, around sunset. All right, she said. She started to turn back toward her wagon. Miss Carter, he said. She turned. Would you want to eat supper in town before you drive back? The boarding house does a good meal on Saturdays. It was so direct and so simple that it caught her off guard. No elaborate performance, no pretense. Just a question, offered plainly, with the same quality of leaving the door open and waiting for her to walk through it or not. Yes, she said. I think I would. They ate at the boarding house kept by a woman named Mabel Hinton, a practical Texas widow who ran the best table in Callow Creek and had an opinion on everything, and kept them to herself with the discipline of a person who understood that business depended on a neutral public character. The food was good, roasted chicken and potatoes and summer squash and cornbread that was better than anything Harriet had managed in her camp stove, and the conversation was better. They talked about the land. They talked about the Homestead Act and its practical realities and its gaps, about the Territorial Commission and its irregular reliability, about the difference between the legal West and the actual West. They talked about where they had come from Cincinnati, Missouri, the long roads that had brought them both to this specific town in this specific year. They talked about the wheat and the winter, and Levi told her about a technique for sealing sod walls against moisture that he had learned from a Mennonite farmer 3 counties west, and she told him about her method for reading the clay soil for moisture retention, which she had worked out empirically over her first dry summer. They talked for 3 hours. Mabel brought more cornbread without being asked, and refilled the coffee with the expression of someone who was professionally not noticing what was plainly happening at the corner table. Walking back to the livery stable in the blue dark of the summer evening, with the stars immense overhead and the town settling into its night sounds, Harriet was aware of something that felt like danger of a different kind than the kind she had been managing. It felt like the opening of a hidden door she had not known was built into the wall of her careful, self-constructed life. I planned to be alone, she said, because she was a person who said things plainly when they mattered. When I came out here, I planned on it very deliberately. I watched what marriage did to women's claims. Under the law, a married woman's property became her husband's. I read the court cases. Levi walked beside her at the unhurried pace of someone making no pressure of any kind. That's the current law, he said. You're right about it. So I plan to do this alone, she said. Because the legal structure requires it if I want to keep the claim in my own name. That makes sense, he said. She looked at him sideways. You're not going to argue with me about it. Why would I argue with your legal reasoning? You're right. He looked up at the stars for a moment. There are women who have managed it. Susan Sumner over in Abilene holds her claim through a clause in her filing. Ellen Morris in Salina is widowed, holds her property cleanly. The law's not absolute, it just requires navigation. You've looked into it, she said. I have been, yes, since about 3 weeks after you sat across my desk. The admission lay between them, frank and a little vulnerable, exactly the way that the most important admissions tended to be. She stopped walking. He stopped. Why? She asked. He turned to face her in the dark street, and the expression on his face was the most open she had seen it. No performance, no protection, just a man looking at a woman and meaning it fully. Because I'd like to court you, Harriet, and I don't want to do it in a way that costs you anything you've worked for. So I thought I should understand the legal situation before I said anything about the personal one. The use of her first name was quiet and careful, and it landed in her chest like a stone dropped in still water, sending rings outward through everything. She was quiet for a long moment. The night insects sang in the grass at the edge of town. Somewhere down the street, the saloon offered its muffled music to the dark. "That," she said slowly, "is the most thoughtful thing a man has ever said to me in that particular context." Something in him relaxed, the same small easing she had noticed at the livery. "I'll take it," he said. She allowed herself a smile, which was not a frequent thing and meant more for the rarity. "I am not ready to make promises," she said. "I have a claim to prove out and 3 more years of improvements before I hold the deed free and clear. I won't be distracted from that." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be. But," she said, "I find your company worth seeking out. And I would not be opposed to seeking it out in a somewhat more deliberate way." "That sounds like a fair arrangement," he said. She started walking again. He fell back into step beside her. After a moment, in the easy, natural way of something that had been true for a while and was only now being acknowledged, he offered his arm. She took it. They walked back to the livery in the summer dark, and it was not a grand, romantic moment in the sense of novels. It was something quieter and better. Two people who had looked at each other clearly, said the true things, and arrived at a beginning that had no hidden motives and no dark deceptions. Only the careful honesty of people who had both, in their different ways, been burned by the cost of things left unsaid. The trouble with Randall Cobb escalated in September of 1874, 3 months after that evening walk. Harriet had harvested her wheat, a modest but real yield, better than her first year's planting, and enough to sell a portion at the Ellsworth grain elevator and reinvest in seed for a larger winter planting. She had expanded her fence line another quarter section, consistent with her improvement plan, and she had filed the expansion properly with the land office over Pruitt's obvious displeasure. Cobb came himself this time. He rode to her claim on a Wednesday morning with Dutch Carver and a man she didn't recognize, a man in a territorial commission jacket who carried a leather satchel with the careful importance of a man who thought his documents were going to decide something. Harriet was in the root cellar when she heard the horses, and she came up into the September light squinting and set her lantern down on the cistern cover and waited. Cobb was larger than she had imagined. He was perhaps 50, broad through the chest, with a cattleman's weathered face and the particular expression of a man who had spent decades having his way in things, and wore the habit of it so deep it had become indistinguishable from his personality. He was not crude, which she had anticipated. He was well-dressed and soft-spoken, and he smiled at her with the genuine warmth of someone who had decided they were going to be reasonable. "Miss Carter," he said, dismounting with the ease of a man 20 years younger. "Randall Cobb, I don't believe we've met directly." "No," she said, "Mr. Cobb. I appreciate your time." He gestured at the man in the commission jacket. "This is Thomas Aldgate from the Territorial Land Commission. He's been reviewing several homestead filings in this district." Aldgate nodded at her with the non-expression of a bureaucrat who had been hired to produce a specific result. She felt the trap close slightly around her, the shape of it becoming clear. "I see," she said. "Miss Carter," Cobb said, still pleasantly, "there has been a technical question raised about the survey on this claim, specifically the eastern boundary. Mr. Aldgate has reviewed the original survey, and there's a discrepancy in the monument placement that puts approximately 20 acres of what you filed on within a prior improvement noted in Cobb Ranch records from 1869. She looked at Aldgate. "What prior improvement?" Aldgate opened his satchel and produced a document. "A line rider's camp, noted in the survey records as a temporary structure, which under the Territorial Code of 1868 can constitute. A temporary structure by a line rider does not constitute an improvement under the Homestead Act," she said. The act requires a dwelling of specified dimensions and permanent improvements to the land itself. A line rider's camp is neither. Aldgate blinked. He had not expected her to know the code. "Miss Carter," Cobb said, with a slight shift in tone, still patient but with something harder underneath it now, a bedrock that had been there all along and was simply showing itself. "I want to be honest with you. This process is going to be long and expensive. The commission review will take at minimum 6 months. During that time, your improvements are legally protected under the pending claim," she said. "Until the review concludes and a formal ruling is issued, I have full occupancy rights under the original filing." Cobb looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted behind his eyes, respect possibly, and also the recalculation of a man who had realized that the easy version of this was not going to be available. "You've done your research," he said. "I have. And you've been talking to Atkins." "Mr. Atkins has provided information about applicable law," she said. "I've done the research myself." Cobb put his hat back on and looked out over her wheat stubble and her fence line and her sod house with its stone-cased well, and the careful, deliberate shape of a claim that had been built by a person who knew what they were doing. "You're a stubborn woman," he said. It was not quite an insult and not quite a compliment. "I'm a legal claimant," she said. "Those are different things." He mounted his horse. "We'll be in touch through proper channels," he said, and rode away. She stood in the September sunlight until they were out of sight, and then she sat down on the cistern cover and let herself shake for exactly 2 minutes. Then she stood up, hitched her wagon, and drove to Callow Creek. Levi was not at the sheriff's office. He was at the grain store, helping a homesteader named Francis Hollies. The patriarch of the neighboring Hollies family she had known slightly since her arrival, load sacks of feed onto a wagon. He saw her come around the corner of the street and he read something in her face immediately, the way he was good at reading things without needing them explained. "Hollies," he said, "I'll finish helping you in about an hour. I'll be at the livery." Hollies looked at Harriet and nodded without comment and drove his wagon around the corner. Levi walked to her. "What happened?" She told him about Cobb and Aldgate and the fraudulent survey claim quickly and precisely. His expression went through several things as she talked: attention, recognition, anger, and then the particular focused stillness of someone planning. "Aldgate," he said when she finished. "From the commission office in Topeka. He had credentials. I know of him. He's done this before in 2 other districts. Produced an irregularity finding that took months to disprove and cost the filer their harvest season in legal fees." His jaw was set. "We need to get ahead of this." "I know," she said. "What are the options?" "Your original survey was done by Arthur Pennock, who's out of Ellsworth. He's reputable and he keeps meticulous records. We get his files on your eastern boundary. We file a counter-survey request with the commission before Aldgate's finding becomes official, and we document the timeline of Cobb's prior communications as evidence of a coordinated pressure campaign rather than a legitimate technical concern." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about the legal specifics." "I've been thinking about you," he said, and said it so plainly that the romantic content of it went off like a flare in the middle of a legal conversation, leaving them both briefly standing in it. She felt warmth move up her throat. "Yes, well," she said. "Let's think about the legal specifics first." He looked slightly pleased by this, the way a man looks when he has made a gamble and had it go well. "Yes, obviously." They spent the afternoon at his desk, drafting the counter-survey request and organizing the documentation of Cobb's interference attempts into a timeline that told a clear and damning story. The offer through Carver in May, the threat implied against her property, the conversation in this office, the Aldgate visit. She wrote in a clear, firm hand while he reviewed statutes in the territorial code book, and Mabel from the boarding house brought them a covered plate of supper without being asked, set it on the corner of the desk, and left without a word. By evening they had a package of documents ready to go by post to the county seat and a copy to be filed with the Territorial Commission office in Topeka. Levi would take them personally to the Ellsworth post office the following morning, which was faster and more reliable than the Callow Creek mail. He walked her to her wagon in the late evening. The street was quieter, the trading day done, the saloon doing its steady business, the rest of the town settling. "Harriet," he said, at the wagon, and she turned, and the evening light was doing something to his face that made him look less like a deputy and more like just a man, which was somehow more affecting. "If Cobb escalates beyond the legal channels, I know," she said, "but I want to fight this the right way first. I want to win it legally because then it's actually won." "I know," he said. "I just need you to know that I'm not going to stand by if it moves past the legal." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the street, carrying the smell of the prairie and the faint sweetness of late-season grass. "I know that too," she said. "Thank you for today." She drove home through the dark, and the stars were enormous, and she thought about what it felt like to have someone on her side in a way that was not about possession or rescue, but about something she had not had a word for until recently. Partnership. That was the word. The winter of 1874 to 1875 arrived early and hard, driving down out of the north with the kind of intent that suggested the prairie was personally invested in the outcome. Harriet had prepared well. Her root cellar was stocked. Her hay stores were laid in. Her livestock, which had grown to include 2 milk cows and a dozen chickens in addition to her 2 plow horses, were settled in a sod barn she had built in September. She saw Levi less, because the roads were difficult and his duties kept him closer to town through the worst weather, but they had established a system. She would ride to the western fence post on clear days and tie a strip of red cotton cloth to indicate all was well, visible from the road. If the cloth was missing, he would come out. It was a practical system of the kind that the frontier produced, where sentiment had to prove its worth through function. The cloth was always there when he checked. She was always all right. But the winter gave her time to think, and what she thought about, in the long evenings by the sod-burning stove with the wind pressing against her walls like a living thing, was the question of what she wanted her life to look like when the proving-out period ended. When the claim was fully hers, undeniable, patent in hand. She thought about what she had told him that first evening in the summer street, that she had planned to be alone because the law made partnership costly. She thought about what he had said, that the law wasn't absolute, it just required navigation. She had spent the winter reading. Not the Homestead Act this time, but the court decisions around married women's property rights, the state-by-state variations, the cases where women had retained their property claims through marriage by specific pre-filing agreements, the legal arguments being made in Kansas and other territories for expanding those rights. It was complicated and uneven, and the law was often frankly unjust, but it was not, as he had said, absolute. In February of 1875, Levi rode out on a Tuesday with a letter from the Territorial Commission. He arrived at mid-morning when the sky was white with high thin clouds and the snow was packed hard underfoot, and she saw him coming from the window and went out to meet him before he reached the door. He held out the letter without preamble. She opened it with cold fingers. The commission had reviewed the Aldgate finding and the counter-survey request. Arthur Pennock's original survey was upheld. The eastern boundary of her claim was confirmed. Aldgate's irregularity finding was dismissed as procedurally improper. In a final paragraph that read to Harriet like the most beautiful prose she had ever encountered, the commission noted that a pattern of coordinated interference with this and several other claims in the district had been flagged for further review, which was not quite a rebuke of Cobb but was close enough to one that she could see it from here. She stood in the cold and read the letter twice. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. He was watching her face. She looked up. The relief was so large, she did not quite know where to put it. She had been carrying the Cobb situation for 9 months, the accumulated weight of a threat that was always present and never fully resolved, and its lifting was physical. She felt it leave her shoulders, and she breathed in the cold February air and something in her face changed. He covered the distance between them in 2 steps, and she looked up at him, and he kissed her with the particular care of a man who had been thinking about doing so for a very long time and wanted to get it right. It was cold and brief, and it was everything. When they separated, she looked at him, and he was looking at her with that gray openness that she had never fully stopped noticing since the first day in the land office. "I've been thinking about the law," she said, because she was Harriet Carter and she processed large feelings through useful action. "So have I," he said. She told him what she had been reading through the winter. He listened. He had, unsurprisingly, been reading many of the same cases. They stood in the cold outside her sod house and talked about legal strategies for retaining property rights through marriage with the focused seriousness of 2 people who wanted a future badly enough to plan it carefully. And somewhere in the middle of it she started laughing, because there was something so particular about the 2 of them that it could not be helped. He looked at her with a soft, surprised expression. "What?" "I have never," she said, still laughing, "in my life discussed marriage law with a man I was kissing. It's remarkably sensible." "Is that bad?" he asked. "No," she said. "It's exactly right." She looked at him. "Levi, I want to be very clear about what I am saying. I'm not saying yes to anything yet. I am saying that I want to when the time comes, and I want to do it in a way that doesn't cost either of us anything that matters. That's all I want," he said. His voice was quiet and certain. "Harriet, that's everything I want." The spring of 1875 brought with it a growth that was not only botanical. Harriet's second full planting went in with the larger scope she had planned, 60 acres of winter wheat, and a spring sorghum crop on the acres she was bringing into cultivation for the first time, which were the difficult clay acres she had always known would come good with time and attention. The fence line was extended again. She hired a young man named Calvin Marsh, Obadiah's nephew, for the planting weeks, a good-humored 18-year-old who worked without complaint and had learned from his uncle the same vocabulary of compressed approval. Levi came out on Tuesdays and Fridays as he always had, but now he stayed for supper as often as not, and they fell into the easy rhythms of people building something shared. He fixed a section of her sod barn roof that had shifted in the winter. She helped him with a report he was drafting for the county seat about the pattern of homesteader interference that had been flagged by the commission. He read to her sometimes in the evenings from the newspapers he brought from town, and she read to him from the legal text she was still working through. She loved him. She had known it for a while and named it to herself with the same directness she applied to everything else, and it sat in her chest like the fact of her claim, certain, earned, and hers. The summer brought news that changed some of the calculus. The Kansas Territorial Legislature was in active debate over a married women's property bill that would, if passed, allow a woman who held a homestead claim prior to marriage to retain it in her name through the marriage. It was not guaranteed to pass. It was not a clean solution. But it was movement in the direction that both of them had been tracking. "How long before it's decided?" she asked in July, sitting across from him in the evening outside her sod house where they had taken to having supper when the weather was good, the prairie stretching out in all directions under the long summer light. "Best estimate from the papers, end of the year," he said. "Maybe early 76. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. Her claim proving out date, the 5 years from original filing was April of 1878. She had 3 years left of formal improvement requirement. "I don't want to wait 3 more years," she said. He was very still for a moment. "Tell me exactly what you mean," he said, not because he didn't understand, but because he wanted her to say it in her own words. "I mean I want to marry you," she said, looking at him directly, "and I want to do it without giving up what I've built, and I think we can find the legal path to that if we're careful, and I don't want to wait 3 years to start looking for it." He was quiet for a long moment that felt to her like a held breath. Then he reached across the table and took her hand in both of his, which were large and work-hardened and very gentle. "I've been waiting for you to be ready to say that," he said. "I was starting to wonder if I should say it first." You could have, she said. I know, but I thought you needed it to be yours. He paused, like the claim. She looked at him for a long moment, this man. This careful, honest, gray-eyed man who had understood from the beginning exactly what it was she was building and had never once tried to stand in front of it or redirect it or make it smaller so it would fit into a shape that was more convenient for him. Yes, she said, like the claim. They were married in December of 1875 at the Callow Creek Church, which was by then fully constructed and presided over by a practical Methodist minister named Reverend Galloway, who performed the ceremony with a brevity that both of them appreciated. Obadiah Marsh attended and expressed approval through the particular silence he reserved for things he found fully correct. Mabel Hinton baked a cake with dried fruit and brought it to the boarding house dinner that followed, and Frances Holly's wife Sarah cried with the generous emotion of someone who had been watching the whole story from the neighboring section and found the conclusion satisfying. The Kansas Married Women's Property Bill passed in January of 1876, 4 weeks after their wedding. It was not the broadest version that advocates had wanted. There were restrictions and conditions, but it included a specific provision for pre-existing homestead claims held by women prior to marriage, which meant that Harriet Carter Atkins, as she was now legally named, retained full and sole legal title to her 160 acres of Kansas grassland, the wheat fields and the sorghum acres and the stone-cased well and the sod barn and the cellar and the fence lines and all of it. Clear and undisputed. She read the newspaper account of the bill's passage sitting at her kitchen table. She had a proper table now, pine-planked, made by a carpenter in Ellsworth, and she felt the specific satisfaction of a thing built to last. Levi read over her shoulder. He refilled her coffee without being asked and put it down and kissed the top of her head, and she reached up without looking and took his hand briefly, and then let it go so she could finish reading. Randall Cobb's ranching operation contracted significantly over 1876 and 1877, as the cattle drive economics shifted with the spread of homesteading and the closing of the open range. He was not ruined. He had enough acreage and proper patent to continue operating at a reduced scale, but the era of the open-range cattle king was ending in Kansas, and men like Cobb were living in its late afternoon whether they acknowledged it or not. Dutch Carver left the territory entirely, which Harriet noted without ceremony. Prout retired from the land office in 1877 and was replaced by a younger man from Topeka who processed claims with bureaucratic efficiency and no particular agenda. The sheriff, Horatio Vance, retired in 1876, citing health, and the county elected a new sheriff the following spring. Levi Atkins was the candidate who ran on a straightforward platform of enforcing the law as it was written, and he won by a margin that surprised most people except Harriet and Obadiah Marsh, who had watched the homesteading community grow over 4 years into a constituency that substantially outnumbered the old range interests. He wore the new badge sheriff, not deputy, with the same unceremonious manner he had worn the old one. He told Harriet about the election results that evening with the same tone. He used to tell her about anything that required a practical response. She had stood up from her field journal and hugged him with a fierceness that surprised him slightly and pleased him enormously. "This changes things," she said. "It changes some things," he agreed. "The pay is better. The jurisdiction is wider," she said. "You'll be away more." "Yes," he looked at her. "We have time to figure out what that means." They had, in fact, already been figuring it out for months, in the way that they figured everything out, by talking about it practically and honestly until the shape of the solution emerged. Calvin Marsh had become a full-season hired hand by then, reliable and capable, which meant the claim did not require Harriet's constant presence for every task. She had also begun, in the winter of 1876, what she thought of as the next phase of her original plan. The crop diversification and market development that would turn her homestead claim from a subsistence operation into a producing farm with income beyond subsistence. She was corresponding with the Kansas Agricultural College in Manhattan about soil studies. She had a small herd of dual-purpose cattle, a mix of Texas Longhorn and Shorthorn that Levi had helped her acquire from a rancher going out of business in the South County, that were providing both beef income and dairy product for sale at the Callow Creek General Store. She had planted an orchard on the southern acres, 5 rows of apple trees whose first proper fruiting was still years away, but whose roots were going down into the clay earth with the same patient determination she recognized in herself. The summer of 1877 brought something she had not planned for, though in retrospect she should have anticipated it. She was pregnant. She told Levi on a Tuesday evening in June with the same directness she brought to everything, sitting across the table from him with the supper dishes pushed aside. He went very still in the way she had learned meant he was processing something that mattered enormously to him. "Are you well?" he asked first. "Entirely," she said. "How do you feel about it?" She considered this honestly. "I feel full," she said finally. "In a way I wasn't expecting. I planned for the claim. I planned for the farm. I planned for you eventually in my own way. I did not plan for this, and I find that I am not upset by the unplanning. That surprises me." He came around the table and knelt beside her chair, which was a gesture so unlike his usual economy of movement that it made her catch her breath. He took both her hands in his, and he looked at her with everything he had, all of it. No protection, no practiced restraint, just Levi Atkins looking at his wife in the way that some men never managed because it required a completeness of feeling that not everyone had and fewer could show. "Harriet," he said, "I want you to know that this, all of it, the land, the work, you, this, I didn't expect it either. I came to Callow Creek to do a job. I did not expect to find someone who made me understand why the job mattered in the way that you do." She looked at him for a long moment. "Flattery," she said, but she was smiling. "Pure fact," he said. "Their son was born in February of 1878, delivered by the Callow Creek doctor, a competent and efficient man named Whitmore who had settled the town the previous year, and who declared the boy healthy and well-made with the satisfaction of someone for whom healthy deliveries were professional success. They named him James Obadiah Atkins, the second name for the neighbor who had been the first to show Harriet that the Kansas land could be known and survived, who received the honor of the namesake with a grunt of deep approval that Harriet had long since learned to translate as the most genuine emotional expression in his vocabulary. The Homestead Act's 5-year requirement for Harriet's claim expired in April of 1878, exactly as scheduled. She filed for final patent, the full and complete deed, free and clear, no further conditions with the land office, now presided over by the new agent from Topeka who processed it with the same efficiency he brought to everything. The patent arrived on a Wednesday in May, delivered by mail from the county seat, a formal document on heavy government paper with an embossed seal, and her name printed across it in the official typography of federal ownership. Harriet Jane Carter, now Harriet Jane Atkins by marriage, but holding the claim in her original filing name as the law now allowed. She held it in both hands in the kitchen. James was asleep in the next room. The morning light came through the glass windows she had installed the previous fall, real glass, a frontier luxury she had permitted herself as a 5-year mark of arrival. The wheat was coming up green on 60 acres of her fields, visible through the window in the particular bright green of May growth that was, she had come to believe, the most beautiful color in the natural world. Levi was at the county seat on sheriff's business. He would be back by evening. She set the patent on the table and looked at it. 160 acres of Kansas earth, officially and permanently and legally hers. The well she had drilled at 32 feet. The sod barn that Calvin had helped her expand in the 3rd year. The apple trees she had planted in hope, now 5 years old and coming into their first serious bearing. the fields that had grown from 60 to 95 cultivated acres over 5 years of steady, intelligent, backbreaking effort. The root cellar full of stores, the cattle herd now numbering 31 head, the chickens, the kitchen garden, the pine table, all of it accomplished exactly as she had calculated it could be when she had sat in Cincinnati with the folded Homestead Act and the $200 and the absolute refusal to be talked out of it. She sat for a long time in the May morning light, and then she picked up her son from his crib and carried him to the window and showed him the green fields. "This is yours too," she told him, "when you're grown. You'll know what it cost and what it means, and then you'll decide what to do with it." She paused. "And whatever you decide, I will not try to talk you out of it." James regarded the window with the philosophical expression of a 3-month-old man whose thoughts on real property were still developing. When Levi came home that evening, she was outside by the fence, just standing, watching the light go gold and then copper over the wheat. He rode up and dismounted and stood beside her, and she put the patent in his hand without a word. He read it. She watched his face. When he looked up, there was something in his expression she could not name exactly. It was not pride, which would have been about him, and it was not just happiness, which was too small. It was the expression of someone seeing the conclusion of a story that has been building for years and finding that it is even better than the build-up warranted. "Harriet Carter," he said softly, using her claim name, the name on the patent. "Harriet Atkins," she said. "Both." He folded the patent with care and gave it back to her. She put it in her coat pocket, against her heart, which was where it belonged. They stood together in the copper evening on her land, and with that understood between them as something absolute and unthreatened, also in the deepest sense their land. And the wheat moved in the evening wind, and the apple trees stood in their young rows to the south, and somewhere in the house James, Obadiah Atkins, was making the preliminary sounds of a person who had slept long enough and was interested in supper. She turned from the fields and went inside, and he followed her, and the door of the sod house, which was no longer purely sod, having been extended and reinforced and enlarged over 5 years, until it was something between a sod house and a proper farmhouse, all of which she had built closed behind them against the evening wind. The following years settled into the particular shape of a life that has been built on a foundation that will hold. Not without difficulty. The frontier was never without difficulty, but with the specific quality of difficulty that comes from weather and markets and the ordinary challenges of agricultural life, rather than from men with hidden motives trying to take what was hers. Levi served as sheriff for 3 consecutive terms, through 1882, when he chose not to stand again, because the work of the farm had grown enough that his full presence was needed, and because James was 4 years old and asking questions about the horses with a focused intensity that suggested a boy who needed a father around in the mornings. The farm grew. By 1880, she had 110 cultivated acres, the apple orchard coming into full production, a cream operation with the dairy herd that supplied the Callow Creek store, and the newly arrived town of Holly's Station, 7 miles east, named for the Holly's family, who had organized the settlement that grew up around the rail spur that arrived in 1879 and changed everything. She hired a second farm hand by 1881, a young woman named Ida Briggs who had come out alone from Ohio on a filing of her own 3 sections south, and who Harriet recognized immediately with a feeling of fierce kinship as a person operating on the same fundamental principle, that the land was hers to earn. Harriet and Ida became friends in the particular way of women who understood each other without needing extensive explanation, and Harriet shared everything she had learned in her first years. The well drilling technique, the moisture reading method, Obadiah's soil knowledge, the legal precedents she had built her library of notes on, with the same open generosity she wished someone had shown her in Cincinnati. When Ida eventually fell in love with Calvin Marsh, which happened in 1882 with the inevitability of 2 practical young people who worked a quarter mile apart through every season, Harriet and Levi, attended the wedding at the Callow Creek Church, and Harriet told Ida everything she knew about the property law, which by 1882 was considerably better than it had been in 1875, but still required navigation. Their second child arrived in 1881, a daughter they named Clara after Levi's mother, who had died in Missouri in 1873, and whom Levi still spoke of with a quiet, steady grief that Harriet had come to understand was the measure of how good his mother had been. Clara was born in the spring and was, from the first weeks, a person of decided opinions and considerable volume, which Harriet found deeply gratifying. Obadiah Marsh died in the winter of 1882, quietly, in his own sod house 2 miles northeast, found by Calvin in the morning with the particular peace of a man who had made his terms with the land long ago and had simply arrived at the end of them. He left his claim to Calvin in a will that was brief and precisely worded, a document as compressed and functional as the man himself. Harriet attended the burial in the Callow Creek churchyard and stood in the cold without moving for a long time after the others had gone, feeling the size of the absence. She drove back from the cemetery in a silence that Levi let be silence, which was one of the things she loved most about him. His understanding that grief did not always want company, only presence. "He was the first person out here who treated me as though it was obvious I could do this," she said finally, miles down the road. "He just assumed I could, without making a point of it. He told me how to read the soil because he thought I needed to know, not because he was deciding whether to help me." "He was right," Levi said. "He was," she said, "and he knew it before I had proven anything. That's different." She paused. "I think about that, about what it means to assume capability in people before they've demonstrated it." Levi glanced at her. "Is this about something specific?" "I've been thinking," she said, "about the school." There had been discussion in the growing Callow Creek community about a proper school. The settlement had grown considerably with the rail spur, and there were now enough children to justify a building and a teacher. The conversations had been going in circles for a year, caught between the question of funding and the question of who would organize it. "Tell me what you're thinking," Levi said. She told him. She had been working out the specifics for months. A school that would serve not only the town children, but the homesteader children spread across the surrounding sections, with a location central enough to be reached, and a curriculum that included practical subjects alongside the classical ones, and a teacher hired on merit rather than on local connection. She had calculated the land donation that would be required, the cost of construction, the funding model. She had, in fact, already drafted a proposal. He listened to all of it. When she finished, he said, "What do you need from me?" The former sheriff's endorsement of the proposal at the town meeting," she said. "You still carry weight with the older families. I carry weight with the homesteading community. Together we have most of the constituency." "Done," he said, without hesitation, without conditions. She looked at him, "Just like that." "Just like that," he said. "Harriet, it's a school. It's obviously right. What would I argue against?" The school was built in the summer of 1883, a proper frame building funded by subscription from the community, and opened in September with a teacher named Miss Adelaide Ferris from Lawrence, who turned out to have a gift for mathematics and a spine like Sheffield steel, and who stayed for 11 years, which was more than anyone had a right to hope for. James started school that first year at 5 years old, sitting in the front row with the other children of the frontier who were learning, simultaneously, to read and to calculate, and to exist in a world that was being made around them and by them. Harriet stood at the back of the room on the first day and watched her son watch Miss Ferris write the alphabet on the board, and she thought about Cincinnati and the folded Homestead Act and the $200 and the long road that had brought her to this moment, to this room, to this particular light. Levi was beside her. He was always beside her now, not in the way of a man who needed to be present to feel certain, but in the easy, natural way of two people who had found that the beside was where they both wanted to be. He leaned slightly toward her. "He looks like you," he said quietly. "He has your patience," she said. "He's 5. He doesn't have patience. He's watching that board like it owes him something. That's your patience." He made a small sound that was a suppressed laugh. Miss Ferris turned to write a word, and the children, including James, leaned forward as one with the magnetic attention of learning happening in real time. Clara, 2 years old, was on Harriet's hip, watching the room with the large dark eyes she had inherited from somewhere in the family line, eyes that took in everything with an unnerving thoroughness. Harriet had worked this land for 10 years. She had planted and harvested and drilled and built and filed and fought and loved and buried her grief and grown her joy on this particular piece of Kansas earth. And it was hers, fully, legally, undeniably hers. And the school was real, and the children were real, and the man beside her was real. And none of it had come from anything except the decision, made alone in Cincinnati in the winter of 1872, that she was going to do it. The afternoon of the school's opening, she and Levi rode the south fence line together, which they had not done in years. The fence was iron wire now, properly strung on cedar posts, not the makeshift line of her early years. The clay fields were dark and rich, changed by a decade of cultivation and amendment, and the apple trees stood in their mature rows, heavy with the late summer bearing that had become one of the farm's primary incomes. "I've been thinking about adding another section," she said. "The parcel south of the creek, the one Aldgate tried to use in the original survey challenge. It's come available. The original filer abandoned in '79 and it reverted." Levi looked at the land in question, rolling grass and clay in the afternoon light. "What would you do with it?" "Expand the orchard, probably. Maybe a proper barn for the dairy operation, which Calvin's section is getting too small for if we're going to grow the herd the way the Holly Station contract suggests we should." She paused. "What do you think?" He looked at the land for a moment longer. "I think," he said, "that you have been thinking about this for a while and you've already calculated it, and you're asking me what I think because you want to know if I see something you've missed." She smiled. "Yes. I don't see anything you've missed. The creek access on that parcel solves the water problem for a larger dairy operation. The clay is the same as yours, which you know how to work. The only question is Calvin's capacity if you're adding another section. He and Ida have talked about taking on a hand of their own," she said. "If they do, capacity is there." "Then file for it," he said. "Before someone else does." She nodded. She would file next week. She had already drafted the paperwork. They rode in the easy quiet of two people who had talked everything through so thoroughly over 10 years that the silences between the words were full rather than empty. The late summer light fell golden on the wheat stubble, and the orchard rose, and the dark cultivated earth, and the grass of the new section she was already thinking of as part of the farm, which it was not yet but would be, because she had decided it would be, and she had 10 years of evidence about what her decisions tended to produce. The evening star came up above the eastern horizon, the first bright point in the fading blue. "James asked me today," Levi said, "where the land comes from." She glanced at him. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to ask you." She looked forward between her horse's ears at the long, flat Kansas horizon. "What did he say?" "He said he would." Levi paused. "He's going to come to you with about 400 questions." "Good," she said. "I have 400 answers." She thought about what she would tell him, about Cincinnati and the Homestead Act, about the $200, about the 32-foot well and the clay soil and the first winter and the hard second year and the Cobb situation, and the deed she had held in white-knuckled hands in the land office while a man tried to take it from her. About the man who had walked through the door and taken the side of the law and left her to do her own work, and then asked her to supper in the plainest, most direct way imaginable. About what it meant to earn something. About the difference between land given and land earned, and the way that difference lived in the hands and the back, and the particular quality of the satisfaction when you stood in the evening light and looked at what you had made. About how none of the men in Cincinnati had been right, not about the land and not about her, and how the only person who had been right about her, before she had proven it, before there was evidence, had been a grain-counting Kansas widower who spoke in grunts and assumed, without making a production of it, that a woman who showed up and asked questions and paid attention was a person who could do the thing she said she was going to do. And she would tell him about Levi, about the gray eyes and the careful record-keeping and the evening walk and the years of riding the fence line in the quiet and the patent in her coat pocket against her heart. She would tell James all of it, because he deserved to know where the land came from and what it cost and what it meant. And then she would tell him that it was his to inherit and his to decide about, and she would not try to talk him out of whatever he decided, which was the inheritance she intended alongside the acres. The stars were coming out now, the great flat Kansas sky filling with them the way it always did, extravagantly, as though the frontier nights felt it necessary to make up in stars for what they lacked in shade trees. Levi reached across between the horses and put his hand briefly over hers on the reins. She turned her palm up and held his hand, and they rode home through the dark to where the lamp was burning in the window of the house she had built, and the children were inside, and supper needed making, and tomorrow the fields would need attention, and all of it, every bit of it, was hers, and known and chosen and loved. The gate at the lane to the farmhouse was a new one, wrought iron with cedar posts, put up the spring before when Levi had taken a week to rebuild the entrance lane properly. She had told him it was unnecessary. He had told her that the farm deserved a gate that matched the rest of it, which was now a serious operation on serious land, and she had conceded the point because he was right, and because watching him work with his hands was one of the quiet pleasures of 10 years together that had never diminished. She unlatched the gate from horseback and swung it open, and they rode through, and she latched it behind them, and the house light was warm, and the smell of the supper she had put on the stove before their ride was carrying out on the evening air, and Clara's voice was audible through the open window, delivering some strong opinion to whoever was listening. "That is absolutely your daughter," Levi said, listening to the tone. "She has your stubbornness," Harriet said. "She has your stubbornness expressed more loudly," he said. "That seems right," Harriet agreed. They put up the horses and went inside, and the lamp was golden on the pine table, and the children were loud, and the supper was ready. And outside the Kansas night was enormous, and the wheat was in the earth, and the apple trees were heavy with fruit, and the second section would be filed next week. And everything that had been built was standing, and everything that had been planted was growing, and everything she had come here for, the land, the life. The love of this careful and honest and steady man who had never once tried to talk her out of it was exactly where she had put it, real and earned and hers.